Companies are developing prescription versions of psychedelic drugs like psilocybin and MDMA to treat conditions including PTSD and depression. There's great promise, but also potential challenges to the healthcare system in supervising patients for hours while they trip. Enter Transcend Therapeutics with a new approach that could be more practical and less expensive. Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. My guest today is Blake Mandell, CEO and co-founder of Transcend. If you like this show, please subscribe and leave a review. Blake, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a great topic. And, of course, when I saw BCG and your background, I had to say, he's going to be a great guest for sure. So I want to talk about what you're doing with Transcend Therapeutics. But before that, and starting off, love to hear a bit about your background, your upbringing, what your childhood was like, any childhood influences that have stuck with you through your career.
Yeah. So I'm initially from the Miami, Florida area. And I was the first person in my family to go to undergrad, to go to college. And so my whole life dream was, I want to go to college and learn and sort of have that more academic experience. And from a very young age, I've always sort of thought there are two big questions in life. One of them is what's out there in space, and one of them is what's in here in our minds. And I always was much more interested in the second one. And so I started sort of reading psychology and philosophy in high school. Made for a bit of a strange high school experience, but it was fun. And so I went off to college. I went to Brown. And while I was at Brown, I had two friends die by suicide. And that was sort of a turning point for me, where all of these things around the mind went from being very intellectual to being very personal. And I sort of said to myself, well, if we can't deal with this mental health problem, and this was, a while ago, and it's unfortunately much worse now, I don't know what we as society are going to do. And so I thought I was going to go be an MD, PhD, a researcher, similar, David, as we were speaking about your father, but I recognized pretty quickly that I was really fascinated with how the world worked and what was actually going on. And so that's why I, went to BCG to sort of as my professional training school, except they pay you, which is great.
Yeah.
And got to work in a whole bunch of different industries. And from there, thought maybe I could work in investing in companies that would help the mental health crisis that we're experiencing, and went to a couple of venture firms. And the last one I ended up with was a firm called Corp, where I was working closely with Kevin Ryan, who's now my co-founder and chairman. And sort of from there, I can get into the story, but sort of that's from where Transcend was founded.
Got it. All right. Well, that sounds good. I'm sorry that was, what happened to friends in college. Unfortunately, it's an all too common story. Not everybody is able then to actually do something about it, as what you're doing. So congratulations on that. Where does the Brown Embodied Neuroscience Lab fit into this? I saw that. Also on your
so
profile.
I had a really fantastic mentor in college, and her name was Kathy Kerr. She initially was sort of in the humanities, and after she was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, got an NIH grant to have a career change into neuroscience. And so I worked with her, and many of the people from the lab are still some of my closest friends. And we did one of the first sort of high quality research studies with Qigong, which is a form of Tai Chi, but more medically oriented, as a medical intervention for post breast cancer fatigue. Many people this whole thing around long COVID has actually been seen often with patients who have sort of survived different cancers, this very severe and life-impairing fatigue. And so we compared it against sort of the best practices of diet and exercise and lifestyle interventions, and saw that it was not inferior, which is interesting because it was much less time than all those things. And with Kathy, she was really someone to teach us how to challenge the establishment, but to challenge it with data. And actually moving sort of into what we're doing now, I was at a conference in November of 2016 And that's actually the weekend when Kathy passed away from multiple myeloma. And that weekend, I happened to run into a really interesting man who made a very special impact on my life. His name was Roland Griffiths. He actually passed away 2 nights ago. But Roland was probably one of the longest tenured professors at Johns Hopkins. The first half of his career, he was famous for the psychopharmacology of caffeine and really studying it. The latter part of his career, he was the founder of the Psychedelic Research Center at Johns Hopkins. And I sat down to dinner with him, having no idea who he was, and was told by, a very sober-minded scientist that psilocybin may have benefit for patients with depression. And so, it was a really pivotal weekend for me, as Kathy passed away, and I met Roland, and, 7 years later, I wake up every day and am inspired by, the work that he's done and helped make possible for many, many else of us. But, one of the things we're doing at Transcend, and I'll sort of get into it a little bit later on, is that we don't think that the vast majority of patients with mental health symptoms and diseases are wanting to have psychedelic experiences.
Yeah.
And so the whole thesis that we have is, what if you could have a lot of the therapeutic benefits without the psychedelic benefits? And so we can obviously dive into that.
No, it sounds good. Well, a lot of formative experiences, relatively early on in your life and in your career. So that is, I think, very, very powerful. You mentioned a co-founder, and I want to know about, who's your co-founder and how did that come about?
Yeah, well, there's 3 of us. There's myself, Kevin Ryan, who is the CEO of Alicorp and one of New York City's most successful serial entrepreneurs in tech and healthcare. He was the CEO of DoubleClick, which is now Google Ads. Everyone's used that product at some point in their life. And then he started companies ranging from MongoDB to Gilt Group, Business Insider, Zola, Nomad Health, and worth over $20 billion in aggregate. And together he and I worked on a few companies. One of them was Pearl Health, which is now an Andreessen-backed company looking at a new sort of Medicare-like mechanism called direct contracting, and now it's ACOs. So that company is going off into the races. But I'd say the majority of the time that I spent working together with Kevin, I sort of told him on day one, my passion is psychiatry, and if there's any way we can work in that, let's do it. And he sort of said to me, all right, well, I've sort of been interested in this psychedelics thing for a couple of years now, given he was on the board of Yale and met my other co-founder, Ben, who is now the founder and director of the Yale Center for Psychedelic Research. And so he said, go off and find me a company to invest in. And that was fun because I got to go out and interview the leading 50 researchers in this space back when there really were only like 50. And now there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It's become one of the major research areas in the field of psychiatry. And at the end of every call, I asked someone, these researchers, okay, let's assume we zoom out 5, 6, 7, 8 years. We assume that psilocybin and MDMA are going to be approved, psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, MDMA for PTSD. What's the downside? What do you worry about? And the answer was basically a unanimous patient access.
Yeah.
So let me sort of walk through the 3 reasons that are gating patient access. The first one is these drugs require a lot of clinical care, and not just from any clinician, but from the most highly qualified clinicians who have went through a lot of training. So MDMA, which has now finished 2 phase 3 trials in PTSD with really fantastic results. Both the trials have been remarkably positive, with some of the most robust results ever seen in the field of psychiatry. Each patient's course of treatment requires 87 hours of clinician time plus medical time. And these clinicians need 100 plus hours of time for training, so there will be some patients who will benefit, but still millions of patients for whom this will be burdensome, given there's already a dearth of clinicians in our country. The second is that MDMA, and not as much psilocybin, but certainly MDMA, is contraindicated for patients who are concurrently on the most commonly prescribed drugs in psychiatry, SSRIs, things like Prozac, where weaning patients off these drugs can be quite difficult, and many clinicians are not comfortable doing so. And the third one, which will sort of be a little funny to you, but within within this sort of like subfield of psychiatry where people are interested in psychedelics, is actually most patients and clinicians would rather not do a psychedelic drug if they could get the same exact therapeutic outcomes without the psychedelic experience.
It sounds like pretty well laid out, and also I can tell your BCG background, because in consulting, there's always three things, and sometimes they'll say there's these two, and then if you forget the third, you say, well, there's a third, but it kind of types into the second or so on. So that sounds good. We were talking before the show of my dad's PhD in social psychology from Harvard, and Timothy Leary was his faculty advisor. And it's interesting when you hear about, this isn't exactly the same, but when someone's going and let's say they're getting painkillers after they've had some procedure, it's like, and people say, well, that must be fun. And they're like, they're not looking for fun. They're looking for, they're looking for impact. And to tie together a couple of the things that you said, well, first of all, if someone's got a moderately successful approach to depression, they're on a medication, it's taken a while to ramp up, they've got some sort of result. They don't want to be weaned off of it then for something that sounds scary and might be scary, and they might not get and might not work. So I can definitely see that the appeal, if you look at it from the perspective of a patient, and then of course as a clinician who doesn't have so many hours, why that could be successful. So it's a great idea to have it, but I mean, how do you achieve it?
Well, first, I think it's one of the things I learned from Kevin is people. So there's three co-founders, and I was very short on the third. Once again, the BCG rule of three. And his name is Benjamin Kalmendi. He's a psychiatrist on faculty at Yale. And he was the first person since 1967, from when probably your dad was working with Timothy Leary, to receive funding from the National Institute of Health to study psychedelics clinically. So he really is, he's broken the barrier for a lot of other researchers who have now been getting initial grants. And so his expertise in helping to navigate through, these three weaknesses of psychedelics, but also bringing out, what is the strength of psychedelics also within the historical context of psychiatry. And the key strength here, there are two. I'm not going to give you three. I'm just going to give you two. So the first one is that in psychiatry, there are a variety of translational models that are used. That means you do things to animals and assume that those will translate to patients. But for the vast majority of the time, they don't have the type of fidelity in translation to patients that fields like rare disease and cancer do. Where in rare disease, if you figure out there's a genetic issue with the patient and you can figure out a way to change that exact genetic issue, the patient oftentimes gets better, which is fantastic. But in psychiatry, these are much more heterogeneous, difficult to define diseases, at least biologically. And so in the field of psychiatry, oftentimes advances in the field are spurred by clinical anecdotes. It's not clinical trials, but just you give a drug to a patient, you see something happens. It might be something different, and it's great because then you learn something. I mean, one example that people find funny is Viagra was not initially intended for that effect, but it was meant to deal with blood pressure, but patients had certain side effects, and that's where they developed it for. And
I think Blake, what happened in that particular trial is that, it's the end of the trial, and they couldn't get the patients to give back their extra medication, which is usually not an issue. And so it took some probing to figure out what was.
Was that really what happened?
Yeah.
I had no idea.
That's how they had the idea. Yeah.
Oh, I had no idea. Wow. And so one of the interesting things here is when you look at this field, like psilocybin was not invented 5 years ago. MDMA was not invented 5 years ago. These drugs have been used for thousands of years for psilocybin and for decades for MDMA. And there were therapists working underground, not in clinical trials again, working with these drugs. And, many patients and clinicians had these anecdotal reports and anecdotal cases of drugs having efficacy. So that's the first thing. We value human data over animal data to translate to patients. The second thing is one thing that was really exciting about psilocybin and MDMA, even linking back to ketamine, which is now approved, the S enantiomer is S-ketamine, Spravato by Janssen for treatment-resistant depression. It actually came out of the Yale group, and Ben has worked with a lot of those people as his mentors at Yale, is this thing called neuroplasticity, which is a very vague term, but basically it means that there is sort of a new induction of new things happening in the brain. And I'm very vague because there are multiple ways of measuring neuroplasticity. You can do neurogenesis, new cells, dendritic remodeling, where neurons basically connect to new neurons. The sort of term is neurons that fire together, wires together, so that you fired new neurons, and that leads to new things. And this has been highly correlated to therapeutic outcomes in ketamine, psilocybin, MDMA, and these are all rapid-acting drugs with neuroplasticity. One interesting thing as well is with SSRIs, they take 6 to 8 weeks to have a therapeutic benefit in patients for whom get a benefit, and this also correlates with neuroplasticity. It just isn't rapid-acting. And so, once again, so just to summarize, it's this: the first thing is clinical anecdotes, and the second is neuroplasticity. And so we went out looking across hundreds and hundreds of drugs for what would solve these three sort of challenges, but also check these two things that we're looking for. We landed on this drug called Methylone, and that's what we've primarily focused on to date. I'm glad to sort of walk into what it is and who our team is and whatnot, but I thought that the story of sort of figuring out, it's sort of very consultant-like, like what are the difficulties you want to avoid, what are the checks you want to hit, and how do you look at drugs across that criteria?
That sounds good. I remember, as you're saying, in psychiatry or neurology, there are these kind of anecdotal effects because when you look at the clinical trials, a lot of times they're using these measures that are actually just usually for screening or something, and it's very hard to actually see anything going on. And never mind, it's just not a very good understanding. So you might have a good drug and it isn't there.
I also want to share another just quick anecdote, and then we'll move on. So the first antidepressant was found accidentally. They gave a drug to patients and saw that their mood improved. And also the first antipsychotic was believed to be testing for some type of, we would now call it anesthesia, but that's not the word they were using back then. And they found that the patients had effects that they thought might be beneficial in patients with schizophrenia, and they did. And so really the whole field of psychopharmacology has started from these anecdotes.
The one that I remember that was a very strong one was more than an anecdote. It was a scientific paper, but they were talking about psilocybin, and they were talking about people who'd had an experience with it, 20 or 30 years ago. And most of them reported that it was one of the, one or two most profound experiences of their life. So it was I remember reading that, and I'm sure I don't have it exactly accurate, but
no, I think you're totally right. Yeah, most patients found it in the top 3, or if not the top 5 most important experience of their life, up, with getting married and having a child.
So let's actually jump ahead and say, assume you succeed. So I was trained in economics. So they'd say, it's like you're stuck in a hole and you have this canned food, and what do you do? And the economist says, assume a can opener. So let's assume that you're successful in all the clinical development and all that. What's the potential impact on the U.S. healthcare delivery system? I heard one thing that was relatively clear, which is that more patients should have access, because no way you can get 87 hours of time in order to have this therapy done by some leading clinician, and also there's the people that'll be scared of it, and so on and so forth. But we talk about that, but beyond that, a lot of what comes into primary care are people that actually root cause is depression, and that's actually a big reason why we have so much trouble with primary care access, is because you've got patients that are there actually for something that's not really primary physical care. Is the ambition that big? Can you actually have an impact, even more broadly than what you had suggested?
So first, we are developing methylone, which we call a non-hallucinogenic rapid-acting neuroplastogen for PTSD. We're in a trial in patients right now, and we can sort of share on when that'll be done, and we'll have some data to present. But we're also going to pursue patients who are suffering from depression and patients who are suffering from anxiety as well. Actually, on our leadership team, the person who leads our clinical development led the clinical development of one of the most recently approved drugs for depression, from IND, which is the first study, through NDA, which is new drug approval. So we have a lot of that expertise in our team, and so our goal really is to develop a drug that can benefit patients across diagnoses. We don't envision methylone being used in primary care settings because a patient would need to come into a clinic to receive a dose. So primary care settings may not be the best setting. There's one interesting trend that's occurring right now that we think lines up really well with these novel treatments for mental health, and that's called interventional psychiatry. So traditionally, psychiatry is psychopharmacology, which means you go see a psychiatrist for 15 minutes. They say, try some Zoloft. You'll come back, say either it works or didn't, and they'll give you a different thing to try if not. But interventional psychiatry is, as it sounds, your psychiatrists are doing interventions with patients. This can range from things as old as ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, to newer things like TMS, transmagnetic cranial stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, to new things like ketamine clinics, which is where ketamine is used off-label. Generic ketamine is used off-label for patients, oftentimes IV or in a shot IM. Even ranging to now Spravato, which was approved in 2019 for treatment-resistant depression. It's intranasal S-ketamine.
Yeah.
And it's now at a $600 million run rate. Janssen's fastest growing product grew over 90% year over year, where a patient comes into a doctor's office and they need to be medically supervised, and they take the drug and then they go home, and they do this a couple times a week for a while. And with our program, a patient will come into a doctor's office, have a medically supervised dose, come back a week later, and do that for 3 or 4 weeks. And, obviously it depends on the data, but our goal is that a patient would then be able to have a response or even go into remission from their disease and come back many months later for the sort of following course of treatment. But the whole thesis isn't that this is a everyday treatment or a twice a week treatment forever. It's an episodic treatment. So when the patient is sort of suffering from the disease, they'd come in and get a course of treatment, and then they'd go off and live their lives the way they want to. And then maybe if it comes back, they'd come and do it again.
Got it. So it will, the impact on primary care is more indirect. So I wasn't necessarily suggesting that it would be, but it should take off if someone's going to kind of this pathway instead of coming to primary care with something like a stomach ache or something.
Yeah,
they can't really be treated.
So interventional psychiatry is growing really, really rapidly. I don't have the exact numbers. We're sort of working on that right now. It's not super clear, but it's more than doubled in the last decade, the number of sort of clinics that are doing this. And we expect it to continue doubling as there become new treatments available that work well in an interventional setting. And so there are obviously two ways that a patient gets into an interventional psychiatry. Their sort of traditional psychiatrist could recommend them, or their primary care doc would recommend them. And so we see this becoming a larger and larger part of psychiatry, just like in many other parts of healthcare. There are sort of, outpatient oncology clinics. There are outpatient infusion clinics for various diseases. So this is sort of becoming more and more a part of psychiatry.
Got it. Talk about the PTSD trial. What is the design of that? How big is it? And what's the path to approval from here?
Yeah. So right now we're in a phase 2 trial in patients with PTSD. All the patients in our trial actually have severe PTSD according to the sort of standard PTSD endpoint that's accepted by the FDA. We've split up the trials in 2 different parts. The first part is, we call it Part A, and it's open label, meaning that all patients are receiving drug. We do this to make sure that we're seeing a safety and efficacy profile that allows us to feel comfortable sort of locking a database and doing a randomized control trial, double-blind, placebo-controlled, which is Part B. So we've now finished enrollment for Part A of 14 patients. We'll be presenting that data in December. And over the next couple of months, we'll be starting the randomized control trial part of it. And
Great.
Hopefully, we expect that to take, 12 to 18 months, depending on how you define the end of the trial.
So the funding environment for startup companies, at least like biotech companies, has been pretty challenging, say early stage in development. What are you seeing in terms of the funding environment, and how does that either relate to what you're doing or you're an exception to it?
I think from what I've seen, investors are really going back to the fundamentals that existed before 2019. So on one hand, it's, worse than 2 years ago, but it's not that bad that if you have good fundamentals, and by that I mean you have an interesting drug with an interesting mechanism, you can demonstrate safety, you have intellectual property, you're going after a big indication, and obviously at the end of the day, if you have efficacy in that indication, if you have those things, I think it's, you can raise money. But biotech went up a lot in COVID, as we as a society saw what amazing things, pharmaceuticals can do for our world with the COVID vaccines. And it's since come down from then. But so there are companies who are struggling, but the companies who have good data and strong teams and strong intellectual property, they continue to move forward.
One of the things that I think may be in your favor is that I notice some investors, now that they're taking a more sober view, are looking at kind of, if you are successful, what's the practicalities of rolling it out? And you see that with like cell and gene therapy. They say, all right, well, gets approved. Now, how is it actually going to be administered? But a lot of the value proposition of what you're doing is actually that this is going to be something where there can be uptake within the healthcare delivery system.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're focused on access from day one, right? We have a wonderful, wonderful team who works tirelessly day in and day out to move our lead drug, Methylone, we call it Transcend 201, sort of forward in each stage of development. And let's say years from now, we got it approved, a patient couldn't use it. It'd be a waste, frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, we're working day in and day out to help patients at the end of the day, not just to do great science, which we also do.
Blake, my last question for you is whether you've read any good books lately, anything that you might recommend.
Yeah. It's actually a book I finished about a month ago, and it's a pretty dark book, but it was probably the best book I read all year. It's called The Best Minds by Jonathan Rosen.
Mm-hmm.
He writes about his childhood best friend named Michael Lauder, who was brilliant. They grew up in New Rochelle, and both of them went to Yale undergrad. And sort of towards the end of Yale undergrad, Michael began to sort of exhibit strange behaviors. Turns out it's schizophrenia, and he was very ill. And it goes through Michael's life going to Yale Law School and being very sick. And Michael was famous in the 90s. Unfortunately, he murdered his fiance and their unborn baby, believing that, she was not the real fiance. It's like a long story, but the way that Jonathan writes the book, he's also worked on other books and he's a novelist and writes nonfiction. It's really beautiful writing. And I think it really illuminates from the perspective of someone who loves their childhood best friend, the pain that untreated mental illness, or I would even say poorly treated mental illness, insufficiently treated mental illness, causes not just the individual, but really the whole circle of people around them who care and love them. And it makes me feel, even more enthused to develop treatments for patients with PTSD who today have only two approved treatments, both of which are SSRIs that were approved previously for depression. So, there's 12 million patients a year with PTSD and two approved drugs. And over 60% of these patients don't end up having sort of adequate responses that last. So it really struck a nerve, and I would highly recommend the book.
Well, Blake, I think you've shared more than the typical number of dark stories as part of this podcast, but they're all for a good reason that you're actually addressing, and I appreciate that very much. So, Blake Mandell, CEO and co-founder of Transcend, thank you so much for joining me today on the HealthBiz podcast. You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.